Welcome. Please turn your attention to our interpretation team.
Buen día a todos. Me llamo Lars y junto con Megan representamos la Cooperativa de Justicia del Lenguaje Tilde. Estaremos ofreciendo interpretación simultánea entre el inglés y el español hoy. Hello, my name is Lars, and together with Megan, we represent the Tilde Language Justice Cooperative. We will be providing simultaneous interpretation in English and Spanish today. Esta sesión será bilingüe. Si usted domina ambos el inglés y el español, no tiene que hacer nada, pero si prefiere el español, por favor seleccione el canal de español. Si usa una computadora, haga clic en el globito con interpretación, o si está usando la aplicación de Zoom en su teléfono o tableta, haga clic en los tres puntitos, luego interpretación de idiomas, luego español y finalizado. Desafortunadamente no se puede acceder a la interpretación a través de los Chromebooks y aparatos de Linux. Today's session will be held bilingually. If you're comfortable with both Spanish and English, you don't need to do anything, but if you prefer to use English, please make sure to select the English channel. If you're using a computer, click on the globe icon that says Interpretation, or if you're using the Zoom app on your phone or tablet, click on the three dots, then Language Interpretation, then English, then Done. Interpretation is unfortunately not available on Chromebooks or Linux-based devices. Unos breves recordatorios para que promovamos juntos un espacio de la justicia del lenguaje. Por favor, silencie su micrófono cuando no esté hablando. Si no domina el inglés, sintoniza la interpretación con sus controles de Zoom para participar plenamente. Y si sintoniza un canal de lenguaje, favor de hablar solamente el idioma de tal canal. Pedimos a todas las presentadoras y presentadores que hablen claro y despacio, especialmente si están leyendo. Y favor de hablar solo un idioma por intervención o frase. A couple quick reminders to help us build a space of language justice together. Please mute your mic when you're not speaking. If you're not comfortable communicating in Spanish, be sure to connect to an interpretation channel so you can participate fully. And if you do join a language channel, please only speak the language of that channel. We also ask all presenters to speak slowly and clearly, especially if you're reading. And please only speak one language per intervention or sentence. Gracias por ayudarnos a crear este espacio multilingüe. Thanks for helping us create this multilingual space. Over to you, Patty.
Thank you, Lars. Good afternoon. I'm Patty Branco with the National Resources Center on Domestic Violence. I'm wearing a yellow top and yellow gold jewelry. I have brown skin and shoulder-length curly hair. Before we begin, we would like to review some brief housekeeping notes with you, and some will be a little recap of what Lars just provided. So we are committed to making this an equitable space in which all people of all abilities can participate fully and in their preferred language. This tasks everyone with the commitment and effort to make a reality. For example, we have limited use of the chat function as it can be distracting and inaccessible to assistive devices. We do invite you to share questions for our presenters in the chat, and you'll be sure to read them aloud so they can be interpreted. While we aim to make this a mixed ability and multilingual space, we also know we are still learning how to do this well. Please reach out to event staff during the webinar if you are experiencing any accessibility issues. We will also ask about accessibility in our post-evaluation survey. Please let us know about your experience, and we always commit to improve. This event features live captioning. You can access this feature by clicking Show Captions at the bottom of your screen. We are recording the event and we share it through our website and YouTube channel. And please reach out to our staff if you are experiencing ongoing technical issues, but please note we may have limited capacity to resolve issues while also hosting the webinar, while the webinar is running. So again, welcome to today's webinar, Self-Managed Abortion, Domestic Violence, and the Law. We gratefully acknowledge the Native peoples on whose ancestral homelands we gather. as well as the diverse and vibrant Native communities who make their home here today. Today, I'm joined from the lands of the Catuaba, Chiró, Sugaree, Wateree, and Waxhaw peoples, and that's the Charlotte area. If this is the first time that you join one of NRCDV's Training Institute webinars, we would like to invite you to connect with us. NRCDV is a national technical assistance provider working to strengthen the capacity of programs responding to domestic violence victims and their families by providing effective public policy, institutional response and research, and engagement in prevention. We work with many organizations and partners who bring various expertise, background, and perspectives to improve community response to domestic violence and prevent its occurrence. So one of the partners we work with that would like to bring on and introduce here right now, it's Provide Inc. and If, When, How. So it's our great pleasure and honor at NRCDV to be partnering with Provide and with How to shed light on reproductive coercion and survivors' reproductive health needs. Today's training will be led by Lo with Provide Inc. and Laura Polk and Rebecca Wang represent If, When, How. The presenters will introduce themselves and their organizations at the beginning of their presentation. And we also invite you to read their bio, which will be shared here in the chat and in a minute, to learn more about the extensive experience and impactful work. So presenters, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Patty. My name is Lo, and I'll be introducing myself in just a moment. A few reminders before we get started. We are raffling off 3 $200 gift certificates for people who complete both our pre and post surveys. So if you haven't done that yet, please complete your pre-survey. Also make sure that the ID you create for your pre-survey is the same one you use on your post-survey. Another housekeeping measure, I just want to say, you are welcome to put questions into the chat. We may answer them as we're going in real time, but we'll most likely save them to our question and answer portions. So just know that if we don't respond to your question immediately, we are aware it's here and we will answer at the end of the presentation. Next slide, please. All right, so good afternoon. My name is Lo and I use they, them pronouns. I am white, wearing a striped button-down shirt. I have short, light brown hair that is buzzed on both sides, and I am wearing brown, wire-framed glasses. I'm joining from the land of Tiwa and Pueblo peoples, also known as Albuquerque, New Mexico. I'm a technical assistant specialist at Provide. This means I work with partner organizations to develop tools, training, and guidance that they can use in their work to improve client autonomy, decrease stigma, and support access to sexual and reproductive health care. I chose this GIF on the screen of a white guy in beige hiking gear. He is in the mountains and looking at a bunch of trees saying, "Wow, what a beaut." I chose this GIF to represent me because if I'm not at my desk, I'm normally in the mountains trying to soak in all of the beauty. Next slide, please. So a little bit about the organization I work for, Provide. We are a national organization, and we work in partnership with health and social service providers to build a healthcare system that is equipped to respond to community needs related to pregnancy and abortion. We envision a system that cares for the whole person with dignity and respect, and where workers have the tools and support to offer the best possible care to their clients. By addressing abortion within the context of the full range of people's needs and our broader values, we help partners make a significant contribution to people's health and autonomy. We do this work by providing free, absolutely free training and support to healthcare and social service organizations across the Southeast and Midwest. Next slide, please. A little bit about who we train. So if you work directly with folks who can become pregnant and may need referrals for abortion care, we work with you. Anyone who works on the front lines. Our trainings and support are ideal for anyone who works directly with folks, and it's not limited to the roles and positions that you see on the screen. So now I'm going to pass it on to Lauren to learn more about if, when, how.
Hi, everyone. It's so nice to be here with you. My name is Lauren Polk. I am currently on Osage land in Missouri. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm Senior Research Counsel at If, When, How, Lawyering for Reproductive Justice. I have white skin with dark brown hair in a bun. I'm wearing pale pink glasses, gold dangly earrings, and a maroon colored top. My work at If When How focuses mainly on legal research and analysis and and public education about how pregnancy criminalization intersects with mandatory reporting. And the GIF that I chose to represent me is of a white woman with dark brown hair in a candy shop exclaiming, "I'm having candy for dinner." I chose this GIF because if I could, I would have candy for dinner every single day. I also just wanted to add a personal note that as a survivor of childhood domestic violence and abuse, I so appreciate the work that each of you do to keep the folks that you work with safe. And I really just am so grateful to be here with you all. Next slide. So this slide has a photo of some of our staff. They are all wearing black t-shirts. They're various races with various different hair colors, and 2 of them are wearing glasses, and 1 of them has a head covering. So just to give a brief introduction to If, When, How, I want to explain 3 things. First, we're national and we're very nerdy. We work on law, policy, direct support, litigation, and building out our movement. And second, we're advocates and attorneys who believe in working toward reproductive justice by attempting to transform the legal system while collaborating across movements and acknowledging the intersection of identities and letting that shape our work. If this is your first introduction to the term reproductive justice, don't worry. Rebecca will share a definition of that later, and we can also send a link to an organization that helped birth reproductive justice, Sister Song Women of Color Reproductive Justice Collective, where you can read more about it. Next slide, please. Lastly, we are working to build a world where all people have the power to determine if, when, and how to define, create, and sustain families with dignity, and to actualize sexual and reproductive well-being on their own terms. In short, we want our work to be in service of the creation of a new world, because the world we live in right now does not allow for equitable access to all of the things I just mentioned. However, the specific piece of our work that we want to focus on with you today is self-managed abortion, or abortion that happens outside of a clinic or hospital that's self-directed by the pregnant person. And on the slide, there's a picture of someone who looks like they're in a call center. They have on little headphones, and it says Repro Legal Helpline, legal services for your reproductive life, including abortion, pregnancy loss, and birth. And then there is a photo of 2 hands clasping, and that says Repro Legal Defense Fund and Abortion and Pregnancy Defense Fund. And then there is a picture of the balancing scales of justice, and that says If, When, How Network. The If, When, How Network mobilizes lawyers and advocates to support people in legal crisis around abortion, pregnancy, and birth. And with that, I will pass over to Rebecca.
Hi, Lauren. Thank you. My name is Rebecca Wang. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm based in Los Angeles, which is land that has historically and traditionally been stewarded by the indigenous Tongva people. I'm a Chinese American woman with black hair that's cut short, and I'm wearing a light blue t-shirt. I'm a senior research counsel at If, When, How, and as part of my work, I provide technical assistance to advocates in the reproductive health, rights, and justice movement broadly, mostly around pregnancy criminalization and legal risk. And I also develop informational resources to put out and publish to support our technical assistance work as well. And we can go to the next slide. Oh, sorry. Let me go back to the slide. I forgot to describe the GIF I chose of myself. This is a clip from the TV show Parks and Recreation. There's a white man in a shirt and tie. He's celebrating a victory. He's clapping and pumping his arms because he just won a board game. And I chose that for myself because I love board games, and I'm also a sore winner. We can go ahead and go to the next slide. So this is just a look ahead at kind of the topics we're going to cover today. And there's a little image on this slide of people attending a protest or an action. It's people of various genders and races in black and white, and they're all pumping their fists in the air. So we've covered our introductions, and then we're going to move on to talking about why is self-managed abortion relevant to domestic violence work. We're going to transition a little bit more to self-managed abortion 101. So it's okay if you're coming into self-managed abortion completely new, and it's okay if you're coming in as an expert. Either way, we're all going to be starting off on the same footing. And then we're going to be covering mandatory reporting, and then we'll be sure to leave time for questions at the end for folks as well. We can go to the next slide. So this next slide has the definition of reproductive justice on it. I'll go ahead and read that out loud. The human right to have children, to not have children, and to raise the children that we do have in safe and healthy environments free from violence. Like all aspects of pregnancy care and decision-making, abortion is a human right, and the criminalization of the people who provide it, support others who have it, or have abortions themselves is happening against a backdrop of mass criminalization and race and class targeted violence by the state against its own communities. In the book, Killing the Black Body, Race, Reproduction, and the Meaning of Liberty, legal scholar Dorothy Roberts explores the history of reproductive control in the US. She writes, "First, we need to adopt a positive view of liberty. Second, the law must recognize the connection between the right to liberty and racial equality. The traditional concept of liberty makes the false presumption that the right to choose is contained entirely within the individual and not circumscribed by the material conditions of the individual's life." We include this quote because it sums up what we're trying to put into action and how this work is part of a reproductive justice framework. We're building an understanding of how laws and policies, which are state-generated barriers, can work together to determine the material conditions of someone's life and compound abuser-generated barriers in the context of access to abortion care. And in the context of intimate partner violence, how state-generated barriers to reproductive health and safety support abuser-generated barriers and what together we might do about it. We can go to the next slide. So here I'll go ahead and ask for recording to pause for a little bit, just so folks can feel kind of more comfortable being on. And then we can go to the next slide, and I will pass it back to Lo.
Right. So thank you all for participating in that values clarification. I think it's really helpful to kind of see where we're starting at the beginning of this presentation. But I want to take a moment to talk about why we are talking about self-managed abortion today. One, I want to mention it's very timely. Self-managed abortion is becoming more prevalent post-Dobbs as access to abortion care within the formal medical system has become more difficult. You may be seeing or hearing about instances of people being criminalized for self-managing their own abortion as well. This isn't a new phenomena, and so we will talk more about it throughout this presentation. We're also talking about it because this is how we address abortion stigma. There's a lot of shame and judgment around the reproductive health decisions that people make, but especially around abortion. So it's important that we talk about this and check in with ourselves about how these conversations make us feel. This helps us process internalized stigma so that we can provide unbiased care to the people we serve. As we go through the presentation today, check in with your body, see how you feel hearing the word abortion, talking about self-managed abortion. It's important to kind of keep track of that and just note where you hold tension, because that may impact your work with survivors. Also, we are having this conversation because the landscape around abortion is constantly changing, which can be extremely confusing. This is why we need to have these conversations and continue to have these conversations. If you don't know what the landscape looks like, it makes supporting survivors extremely challenging. As a reminder, conversations about pregnancy options, including abortion care, should be a regular part of work with survivors. Women and people who can become pregnant may be at an increased risk of experiencing violence from an intimate partner during pregnancy. As a reminder, risk factors for intimate partner violence during pregnancy are pretty similar to risk factors for partner violence in general. However, there are some risk factors that are specific to pregnancy, as it is a time that may demand increased relationship commitment, including time, financial resources, and more. Let's move on to the next slide, please. So I'm going to say a couple things about reproductive coercion. And I want to just note, I assume a lot of you all are familiar with this concept, given your work in the domestic violence field. If you want to click through, thank you. In short, reproductive coercion involves behavior intended to maintain power and control in a relationship related to reproductive health by someone who is, was, or wishes to be involved in an intimate or dating relationship. Understanding reproductive coercion is critical to working with survivors. Next slide, please. So what does this look like? Reproductive coercion can include many things, including explicit attempts to impregnate a partner against their will, controlling the outcomes of a pregnancy, coercing a partner to have unprotected sex, and/or interfering with contraceptive methods. Approximately 20% of women seeking care in a family planning clinic who had a history of abuse also experienced pregnancy coercion. And 15% of these people also reported birth control sabotage. I want to note that the research I just referenced is gendered. We also know that people can become pregnant regardless of whether or not they identify as women. Given this research, it's possible that about 1 in 5 people you work with will have experienced this type of coercion. That is why it's so important that you're ready for these conversations. We'll cover more about this later, but it's important to note that when it comes to self-managed abortion, this might be a key reason why someone chooses to self-manage. As a reminder, not all survivors of domestic violence want to end their pregnancies, but those who do may consider self-managed abortion because it can be done privately, outside of a formal health system, and appears much like a miscarriage. Next slide, please. So on this screen, I have a little image of a person with dark skin on a computer talking to another person with light skin and a little kind of burst of colors coming out of their head. So we know that this is important to talk about, but we also want to know what people in domestic violence work wanted to learn about. So in 2020, we conducted a survey to hear from advocates about whether this topic impacted their work. We got 71 responses, and 95% indicated that they were interested in a training like this, which is why we're offering this training today. Some of the things that also came up in the survey, people wanted to know more about how to support survivors, and they wanted accurate information about self-managed abortion. People wanted to know, what is the law related to self-managed abortion? Is it safe? And what can I do or say? Since this initial survey, we've provided this training multiple times with attendees expressing similar questions. And we hope that today's training will address those questions directly. Next slide, please. So for folks who have attended Provides trainings in the past, this may be a refresher, but let's review why someone might want or need an abortion. One, a child would or could interfere with education, work, or their ability to care for dependents. As a reminder, people know their situation best, and they are the best people to determine their own capacity for pregnancy and/or parenting. Finances is another reason someone might want to obtain an abortion. It can be expensive to parent or go through pregnancy. Once again, people know their own personal capacity and what they can afford. Another reason is not wanting to parent alone or not wanting to parent with the person they're currently with. This reason may resonate with people at this training today who have experience working with people experiencing domestic violence. It might not be a good time to have a child with this particular person. It might also not be safe. Another reason is people may have finished having the number of children they want. Many folks who access abortion care are already parents, and they know what it takes to raise a child. Another reason is folks may not be ready for children or don't want to have children at all. And finally, health-related problems may inform someone's decision to have an abortion. This list that I've just kind of given you all isn't exhaustive, but it is some of the reasons that people lift up when asked why abortion. As a reminder, whatever the reason, it is valid and should be respected, not judged. Next slide, please. So what happens when people can't access the care they need? For folks who wanted abortion care for any of the reasons on this slide before and aren't able to access the care they want, it can increase their odds of unemployment or income under the poverty line. For example, people who have already had children and know they don't have the resources to grow their family, having a baby may change their employment status or lead to unemployment, which can impact finances. Another impact of not being able to access abortion care is an increased likelihood of not having enough money for basic necessities. This can include food, rent, utilities, childcare. If your family has grown in a way that you did not want it to, that can be really hard. I also want to highlight that when people are unable to access abortion care, they may be more likely to stay in contact with violent partners, which is something I'm sure you've heard of in your work with survivors. These are just a few of the impacts of not accessing abortion when it is desired. And I want to remind folks that there are many obstacles to obtaining abortion. This list isn't exhaustive, but distance. For anyone living in states without abortion clinics, you may have to travel hundreds of miles to access care. Finances is a big obstacle. It can be so expensive to access abortion care within the formal medical system. If you've traveled, you may have to stay overnight, or you may need to pay for childcare and other expenses. Stigma is a huge obstacle as well. Abortion stigma impacts who people can lean on and trust when they're trying to access care. And laws exist that make it more difficult to access abortion, even in states without a full abortion ban. For example, waiting periods that require people to wait 24 to 72 hours between an ultrasound and actually receiving abortion care. There are also laws that restrict abortion providers' abilities to provide care, including things like transfer agreements with hospitals and EMS. These laws limit the number of providers that are out there and can put more strain on a system that is already overtaxed, making it harder for people to access care. It's also important to mention, especially in this space, that in states where abortion is banned or severely restricted, some states have exceptions for rape or incest. While this may seem like a positive thing or a way to alleviate barriers for survivors, in practice, research shows that these laws have little, if any, meaningful impact on abortion access. And now I'm going to, I believe, pass it to Rebecca. And you can move to the next slide, please.
Thanks, Lo. Yeah, I just want to follow up with some additional data around reproductive coercion. And all the data presented here is pulled directly from the Reproductive Coercion and Abuse Report that was recently released as part of collaboration between the National Domestic Violence Hotline and If When How, and we'll include that report as part of the resources that you get as part of this presentation. But highly recommend that folks read that if they're interested for full information. But the next two slides will just highlight some big pullouts of summarized data from that report. So between October and December 2023, the National Domestic Violence Hotline, also known as the Hotline, conducted a survey to learn about survivor experiences with reproductive coercion and abuse. All responses were anonymous, and they collected no identifying information about anyone they surveyed, A total of 3,431 people did respond to that survey. And here's some of the data we have. We can go to the next slide. About what those survivors shared. About 63% of all the respondents said that their current or former partner had pressured or forced them to have sex or other sexual activity when they did not want to. 23% of respondents said that their current or former partner pressured them into getting pregnant. 39% said their current or former partner threatened them if they said no to sex or other sexual activity. And 13% of respondents said their current or former partner used or threatened violence while they were pregnant with the intention of ending the pregnancy. We can go to the next slide. And I'll kind of pause there so we can all take a breath because that was a lot of data and information. And I'd like to take a beat because I'm about to pivot us more toward the really technical aspects of self-managed abortion. At If When How, we give this self-managed abortion 101 presentation many, many times a year to really a wide range of groups and organizations. We've given it to legislators, we've given it to people who work at abortion funds, we've given it to healthcare providers, lawyers, law students, medical students, social workers, and so many more. And we have certainly also provided it to advocates and lawyers who work with survivors of intimate partner violence. To ground us in just having a shared terminology and also communicating our values against criminalization of self-managed abortion. And I also think just widely, there are so many items in the news or legislators say so many things about self-managed abortion that are not true and not accurate, that this is really kind of the opportunity to, do some myth busting and come to what is true and what we know to be factual. And we can go to the next slide. So this slide is titled, "What is medication abortion?" There are two images on the screen. It's an image of the packaging for the two medications, misoprostol and mifepristone, which we'll get into a little bit more later on. Medication abortion means an abortion that is done with pills. The standard regimen in the United States is to prescribe these medications in combination, mifepristone and misoprostol. Up to 10 weeks of gestation is generally what they say. The World Health Organization says that this combination is safe and effective for abortion up to 12 weeks and likely a little bit beyond 12 weeks as well. And medication abortions are also done just with misoprostol as well. Millions of people have had safe and effective medication abortions using mifepristone and misoprostol. Misoprostol on its own is slightly less effective, but can also be used safely, especially when and if mifepristone is simply unavailable. During a medication abortion, people generally take the medicines and experience their abortion without the supervision or involvement of a healthcare provider. People can receive the pills via telemedicine in the states that allow it. Telemedicine abortion, whether the pills are provided in person or by mail, is not a self-managed abortion. If the pills are coming from a US doctor who is obeying all the laws and licensing requirements involved, then that is not a self-managed abortion. That is a telemedicine abortion. It does not matter that with telemedicine, a patient may not actually see their doctor in person, that all of their kind of initial intake and follow-up appointments might be completely virtual or even through kind of various chat platforms. That's not what makes the abortion self-managed. It really is critically about the involvement of a healthcare provider. We can go to the next slide. So we use the phrase a lot. What is a self-managed abortion? I want to do some level setting around that. Self-managed abortion, often abbreviated to SMA, is an abortion that somebody does on their own. It takes place outside of contact with what we consider to be the traditional medical systems of this country, so doctors, hospitals, clinics, etc. And even though we say somebody does it on their own, and even though we say self-managed, most often people have support systems and communities with them when they self-manage. There's often friends, family members, partners, community providers, doulas, midwives, etc., who are involved as part of that as well. A self-managed abortion can be done with the very same medications that they use in a clinic, which I just talked about, the mifepristone and the misoprostol. There's also other means. People have traditional cultural means that involve kind of herbal medications or specialized massages that they do. And at times it can be done through unsafe means as well. Our bottom line at If When How is, regardless of method, no one should be criminalized for their abortion. And we can go to the next slide. So self-managed abortion has such a proven track record. The World Health Organization's most recent abortion care guideline, which was published in March of, I believe, 2022, strongly recommends self-management approaches. The World Health Organization says, and it's what they say in their guide is screenshotted on the slide as well. As in previous World Health Organization abortion guidelines, this new guideline supports self-management of medical abortion in early pregnancy up to 12 weeks of gestation. In this guideline, the overall process of self-management, as well as the three component parts of self-management, are now strong recommendations. In other parts of the report, the World Health Organization also goes on to say, from the perspective of the health system, self-management should not be considered a quote-unquote last resort option or a substitute for a non-functioning health system. Self-management must be recognized as a potentially empowering and active extension of the health system and task-sharing approaches. There's also an additional graphic from the World Health Organization on this slide that describes self-management as non-invasive, cost-effective, acceptable, and improving autonomy. We can go to the next slide. So a common question I get asked by people who are not very familiar with self-managing is, so why do people self-manage? And at If When How, we talk about the whys in terms of what we call push and pull factors to illustrate that someone who self-manages is navigating their own set of complex experiences. And we have a graphic up on the slide that shows kind of a colorful continuum with push factors at the top of the continuum, self-managed abortion in the middle, and pull factors at the bottom. And even though on the graphic, push factors and pull factors are at opposite sides of the poles, they're not necessarily always completely unrelated. And most times they are very closely related and may in fact be two sides of the same coin. There are certainly reasons that fall into both categories that are both push and pull factors when it comes to deciding whether somebody will self-manage. So we refer to things that tend to be barriers as push factors. They push people away from clinical care. And conditions that attract someone to self-managing their abortion care and that allows them to make that decision from a place of agency are pull factors. Those are what pull people toward self-managing. It's important to understand that while some people make these decisions out of need, others do because they prefer, for a whole host of reasons, to self-manage outside of the medical system. And some people may prefer to self-manage even when clinical care is an option and is available to them. I need to note that there is a lot of lingering fear that self-managing an abortion means a medically dangerous method, like those that caused people's deaths in the US before Roe versus Wade and in abortion-restrictive countries before the invention of abortion pills. Again, a common symbol I still see at abortion marches today is kind of the inescapable bloody coat hanger. But again, most people self-manage today with pills, and the use of pills worldwide has dramatically changed the public health picture for people who end pregnancies on their own. And a lot of that imagery, including the coat hanger, is actually incredibly harmful and stigmatizing. And just to kind of give some examples of push and pull factors, which are also factors that you all highlighted during the values clarification exercise. Thank you. So a common factor that pushes people away from clinical care is cost and distance, or as Lo mentioned, some clinics that require you to wait 1 to 3 days between your initial appointment and when you can actually get your abortion. For a lot of reasons, people cannot afford the money, they can't travel the distance, they can't arrange for the time off, or they're afraid of people finding out and they simply cannot be away from their home for that long. And then there are pull factors. So what the factors that really attract people to self-managing their abortion, also that y'all highlighted as part of the values clarification exercise, that people like know themselves and know their bodies and know what they need. They want to be able to control when it happens, where it happens, who is with them. They want the privacy. They feel more empowered that way. And of course, I'm sure you can all think of a whole host of other push and pull factors that are relevant to people's decision making as well. We can go to the next slide. So there's a wheel graphic on this slide here that just highlights some of the things that I talked about. Oftentimes a self-managed abortion is the more cost-effective method. Somebody mentioned kind of people may not want to have to navigate abortion protesters that are outside of a clinic. That's a safety thing. Or specifically for survivors, they may not be able to leave the home, or they're afraid that somebody will see them or note that, and it will come back to impact them in a certain way as well. And other kind of summed around this wheel as factors, as pull factors for self-managed abortion: privacy, availability, control, cost, safety. We can go to the next slide. And this is a graphic that shows in kind of a bunch of different circles all the various push factors that you all highlighted as well, and potential harassment and interpersonal violence from somebody in the home, a friend, a family member, is fairly prominent among those factors as well. And the other factors on the slide include, of course, cost, which is one of those factors that is both a push and pull factor, distance, trap laws, all the laws that really restrict the ways in which clinics can provide abortion care, and harassment. And we can go to the next slide. So this slide has two graphics up on it that are pulled from the same report. One graphic is a map of the United States that's in various shades of blue to red that denote the number of requests that were made to Aid Access, which is an online provider of abortion pills. And next to it is a bar graph of people's listed reasons for why they chose to self-manage by ordering pills from Aid Access. So despite the legal risks and well before the Dobbs decision overturned Roe versus Wade, research showed that self-managed abortion was already on the rise in the United States. These graphics are from a study conducted by Aiken et al. At the University of Texas. And these data points were taken between March 2018 and March 2020. So before COVID, before Roe versus Wade was overturned. And there's been subsequent studies since, of course, that have shown increases in interest in self-managed abortion and in people actually self-managing. So on the map graphic, the states shaded in the reds and the deeper reds and oranges show where more people requested abortion pills from Aid Access. The requests to Aid Access were definitely higher in the states that had the most significant abortion restrictions. So states like Mississippi, Louisiana, Alabama, and Wyoming. And the bar graph of reasons shows that the primary reason people listed for why they chose to self-manage instead of going to a clinic was costs. They couldn't afford a clinical abortion. The second reason was fear that a partner or family member would find out, which, while not explicitly mentioning DV, certainly does raise alarms. And further down the list, about 6% of the people surveyed in this study said they self-managed because of risk of abuse from a partner. And people self-manage and have always self-managed despite the reality of legal risk. We can go to the next slide. So I definitely want to talk now about the legal risk landscape for abortion, especially what it looks like now that Roe versus Wade has been overturned, because all of that data I mentioned, that was before when Roe versus Wade was still in place. And we can go to the next slide. So this slide is just a picture of the Supreme Court, because of course we want to talk about the Supreme Court decision, Dobbs versus Jehu. In June of 2022, the Supreme Court decided in Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health Organization that they were going to uphold Mississippi's 15-week ban on abortion. Their decision in that case overturned Roe versus Wade. The picture of criminalization with regard to self-managed abortion has not changed. The majority of states and the majority of cases of self-managed abortion criminalization have always happened outside the bounds of what the law allows. And that is unlikely to change. We know that stigma and state violence is going to increase and continue to increase in the current climate where legislators have banned a human right and legislators seem very motivated to continue to restrict reproductive care access. We can go to the next slide. So since the Dobbs decision, the legal landscape around the country has, of course, shifted dramatically. It has been constant and rapid. And even this map I have on the screen right now, which is pulled from the Guttmacher Institute, showing the distribution of abortion restrictive and abortion protective policies across the US, was updated as of July 2024. Likely, this map itself is probably already out of date in some ways. But it does show in the various shades of red the states that have some of the most severe restrictions, if not a complete ban currently in place. Altogether, about 20 states have one of these bans currently. With the ban states, some are from trigger bans, bans that had been kind of lying dormant in the laws while Roe versus Wade was in place, that kind of automatically triggered and came into effect once Roe versus Wade was no longer the law of the land. Some bans were created anew from completely new legislation. A lot of abortion laws are kind of tied up in lawsuits, and some are temporarily stopped. Others are going on while they're being challenged. It's a constantly changing landscape. The vast majority of these bans do explicitly exempt the person who has an abortion from prosecution. In fact, when Louisiana tried to enact a law that made abortion a crime of homicide, for anyone who either had one or provided one. Actually, the National Right to Life Committee and other anti-abortion legislators fought it and issued a national letter claiming that they oppose prosecution of people who have abortions. But in recent legislative sessions, Arkansas and Oklahoma, among other states, have already tried to introduce laws that would make it a crime for people to have an abortion. But so far, that is generally not the law. Of course, this is pretty cold comfort for those who are targeted by prosecutors, but it is important to understand this in order to hold those prosecutors to the letter of the law and to defend people who are targeted despite this legislative protection from prosecution. And I do want to pause there because I see that we're about an hour in, and I just wanted to offer maybe a 5-minute stretch break, screen break, and then we can kind of pick up from there. And we can also pause recording for the 5 minutes as well. Hey, hi, welcome back, everybody. Just another moment to take a deep breath because this is a lot of information, and most of it is not very uplifting, I know, but hopefully helpful. We can go ahead and move to the next slide. So I talked a lot about kind of these exemptions in the law for people who are themselves the ones seeking an abortion. And this slide just includes some quotes from states with bans that lays out what those exemptions look like. For example, and a lot of this is going to be incredibly gendered. No women upon whom an abortion is performed or attempted to be performed shall be criminally or civilly liable. That's Alabama. This chapter may not be construed to authorize the imposition of criminal, civil, or administrative liability or penalties on a pregnant female on whom an abortion is performed, induced, or attempted. That's Texas. And then finally, Louisiana. Nothing in this section may be construed to subject the pregnant mother upon whom any abortion is performed or attempted to any criminal conviction and penalty. So who are abortion bans going after? They are trying to cut off care at the source. They're overwhelmingly, the target is providers, all the medical providers who are helping people, who had been helping people access abortion care. And we can go to the next slide. And there are also a lot of laws targeting a pregnant person's community of support as well. There's a map on the screen that highlights Idaho, Oklahoma, and Texas in kind of a golden color as states that have civil aiding and abetting laws, which you have probably all heard of to some extent. Some cases also called bounty hunting laws in the news. And if you are located in a state where these laws are in effect, namely Texas, Oklahoma, and Idaho, you probably already have a pretty deep knowledge and may have already been directly affected by the fear that these laws cause and spread. In Texas and Oklahoma, these laws make it possible for someone to be sued in civil court for money for helping another person have an abortion. In Idaho, it's limited to abortion providers, not the people who help. None of these, again, allow a lawsuit against the person themselves who has the abortion. Several other states and Puerto Rico have introduced, but not yet passed, similar bills. And as you probably all know, the impact of these laws has been to chill abortion care, sow confusion, allow people to misuse the legal system in abusive ways. They really attempt to scare and isolate the person who is trying to get an abortion, preventing them from asking their communities of care for help because they don't want their communities of care to get in trouble. And it also puts people in that community of care at personal fear because they don't want to get sued, they don't want to get in trouble, etc. And these laws all undermine basic principles of due process and rule of law. But at this point, we have not yet seen a case successfully filed under any of these laws because it is so hard to prove that somebody helped somebody get an abortion against the law. So we don't really know yet how a court is going to deal with these types of laws. Eventually, courts may decide that these laws are unconstitutional. But unfortunately, just the fact that they exist gives abusers a tool, another tool in their arsenal of threats. That if you get an abortion, I'll report you, and maybe the people who helped you will get into trouble, etc. The laws don't actually have to be used. They just have to send a message that you're being watched, you're being surveilled by the police, that the abuser is able to involve the police or the legal system to be used against that person. We can go to the next slide. So this is a map showing in purple the states Arizona, Oklahoma, Texas, Arkansas, Louisiana, and Tennessee. Tennessee is in a slightly lighter shade of purple because at the time we made this map, its mailing ban had not yet gone into effect, but it has since as of last year. So mailing bans in these states are laws that specifically say providers, manufacturers, suppliers, or any other person cannot provide abortion pills by delivery, courier, or mail. Punishment in these states for mailing against this ban really range from misdemeanors to felonies. Again, we haven't really seen these laws be successfully used because it is incredibly hard to keep track of what people are sending in the mail. The United States Postal Service is a federal agency. States don't really have much control or authority over them. Mailing into these states. Yes, so it prohibits mailing into and usually within these states. And again, it's just really hard to keep track of what people mail, and so much of that is based on like what you actually tell people. So these laws, again, we have not seen them used, but again, it puts out this fear, this confusion about what the law is, this isolation about reaching out and asking for help. We can go to the next slide. So this next map highlights a couple of states in blue, Indiana, Texas, and Louisiana. These are states with laws that make it more expansive to punish people for transporting abortion pills. These states make it a felony for any person to provide abortion-inducing drugs to a pregnant person. So not just by mail, but if they're handing it to them in person, etc., dropping them off, whatever the case may be. In Texas, for example, it is a felony for any person to knowingly provide an abortion-inducing drug to a pregnant woman for the purpose of inducing an abortion. Louisiana's law makes it a felony for anyone who knowingly performs an abortion by means of an abortion-inducing drug. And the penalties, if they are prosecuted and found guilty, are imprisonment at hard labor for not less than 1, but not more than 5 years. And there's also a fine involved in that. Indiana similarly creates potential penalties for anyone else who helps to facilitate an unlawful abortion as well. And what these laws do, again, just like the bounty hunting laws, the civil aiding and abetting laws, it isolates people, prevents them from reaching out, asking for help, seeking information. etc., and really just puts out the threat of criminalization pretty widely around a person who is trying to get an abortion. We can go to the next slide. So this is a map that shows Arizona, Oklahoma, South Carolina, New York, and Delaware in this turquoise color as states that within the last couple of years repealed their self-managed abortion bans. Idaho is in yellow because it does still have a self-managed abortion ban in the books, but a court has found the use of that law unconstitutional, so it's unlikely for that ban to be used against a pregnant person in the future. Nevada on this map is the only state in purple because it does still currently have an explicit ban against self-managed abortion for pregnancies past 22 weeks, and it is a felony to self-manage past 22 weeks in Nevada. But what this map is intended to show is historically, self-managed abortion was not explicitly a crime in most states in this country. Only 7 states historically have had such a ban, and currently just Nevada. We can go to the next slide. But even when self-managed abortion is not explicitly a crime, there have been a wide web of laws that have been used, or more accurately, misused, to criminalize people who have ended their own pregnancies, as well as people who have helped other people end their own pregnancies. And in some cases, the person just experienced a pregnancy loss and was criminalized for that. It was not necessarily that they were self-managing an abortion either. So on this graphic, we have 3 maps. One of the maps is the same one from the previous slide. I think it's a little bit more out of date, but it is the map from the previous slide showing the states with explicit self-managed abortion bans. There's also a map on the top left corner that shows states that have criminal abortion laws. And then there's a map in the middle that shows the states that have fetal harm laws, and I'll get into each of those as well. So criminal abortion laws, and there's about 17 states highlighted on the map with a criminal abortion law. These are laws that were intended to punish people who are not doctors, who pretended to be doctors, or who pretended to provide medical care. These were laws targeting them to prevent them from tricking people into thinking they were actual medical providers when they were not. They criminalized anyone who is not a doctor from performing abortions, and yet they have sometimes instead been used against the pregnant person themselves who has self-managed. And these laws can certainly be used against a family member, a friend who helps that pregnant person self-manage as well. In terms of explicit laws banning self-managed abortion, again, there's only one state, that's Nevada currently. And then there are what we call fetal harm or fetal victim, or you'll also hear them referred to as feticide laws. These were laws originally created to protect pregnant people from harm by others. But they have instead been used against pregnant people themselves who have self-managed. There's also a whole host of other laws that aren't covered in these maps. Prescription medication and possession laws, right? Who can have a prescription medication, for what purpose? Prohibiting them from transferring prescription medications. All of those laws have impacted people as well. And really beyond that, anything and everything else a particularly motivated prosecutor can think of. We really call this the kitchen sink or the spaghetti method, right? They're throwing stuff at the wall and seeing what sticks. And we know prosecutors can get really, really creative when they want to. We see charges like abuse of a corpse, which is a really old law that's intended to prevent grave robbing. We see really old laws like concealment of a birth, really old law that's like intended to establish the parent of a child. We've definitely seen criminal child endangerment levied against people. In some cases, we've seen people try to use homicide, etc. Really, whatever it is the prosecutor thinks will stick, they'll try it. We can go to the next slide, and I will pass it back to Lauren.
Thank you, Rebecca. So I know that a lot of those things sounded scary, but I really do want to illuminate that there are a lot of people, including folks who are here today, working around the clock, essentially, to try and make these realities different, right? To try and change what we're dealing with. I am going to focus my remarks on sort of how criminalization works and how mandatory reporting might come into that. Before I do that, Rebecca, I just wanted to flag for you that there was a question about Indiana and their penalties around some of the laws that you were talking about. I don't know if you'll have time to pull that while I'm speaking, but if you do, please feel free, and otherwise we can follow up individually with that person. So, hello again. My name's Lauren Polk. I use she, her pronouns, Senior Research Counsel at If When How. I want to show folks how unfortunately widespread it is that people are criminalized for their pregnancy outcomes. So the map that's on the screen shows many states in the South, the Southeast, the Midwest, and the Southwest in teal. And the legend tells us that these are states where there were criminal investigations or arrests of an alleged self-managed abortion between the year 2000 and the year 2020. I want to highlight that states like California, New York, and Illinois are colored in teal, which indicates to us that the politics of a state legislature aren't necessarily protective against self-managed abortion criminalization. And the reality is that it could happen in any state. Next slide, please. So self-managed abortion criminalization, like other ways that people are unfairly criminalized by the state, is discriminatory. We know from our research that people who have been prosecuted for suspected self-managed abortion are disproportionately Black, Indigenous, and people of color, and almost exclusively people who are living in poverty. The box on the screen here, so there's sort of an arrow, and it says understanding criminalization. So the first box says it's discriminatory, and then it lists different bullets, sort of how these things discriminate. So race, poverty, gender, disability, informal economies, and by that we mean folks who are doing, for example, sex work. The second box says it's discretionary, and so criminalization is also discretionary, meaning that all of the people involved in charging someone with a crime related to an alleged self-managed abortion, from the initial reporters to the prosecutor themselves, are typically doing this simply because they can or because they think that they should, not actually because the law requires them to. So the box bullets have statutes, constitution, local police, prosecutorial discretion, and social workers. So these are all different ways to sort of illustrate how criminalization can be discretionary based on what's going on in a particular state or county. Karen asks, does discriminatory include age? Absolutely. A lot of the criminalizations that we see, unfortunately, are young people, right? Or their parents in some cases. So yes, age is absolutely on that list. We would consider some cases of self-managed abortion criminalization to be politically motivated, meaning that people might report or pursue charges for self-managed abortion because they're against abortion in general and don't think people should be allowed to have an abortion at all, regardless of how. Criminalization is also circumstantial, meaning that although many people self-manage their own care, the reasons that people are charged with self-managed abortion are frequently linked to medical emergencies and exposure to mandatory reporters. And because of interpersonal violence, meaning family, partners, neighbors might report them to the police as a means of coercion or punishment. So the box on the screen talking about how it's circumstantial includes a bullet that says fetal remains. And so that is supposed to indicate that when folks are later in pregnancy, right, there are more likely to be fetal remains or a lack of fetal remains, which can contribute to that person's criminalization. I also have here medical emergencies. So when people experience a medical emergency after an abortion, which are like very rare, but do happen, and there are also instances where people might think they're experiencing a medical emergency and actually everything's okay. So there's actually a hotline called the Miscarriage and Abortion Hotline. I think it's mahotline.org. And that is actually a hotline that people can call. It's staffed by medical professionals, and people can talk to them about what's going on with their symptoms, either when they're having an abortion or when they're having a miscarriage. And those folks will help them understand, okay, this is normal, or no, that's too much bleeding. We want you to go to the emergency room, or, maybe you can take this for pain, et cetera, right? So that's what the MA hotline is for. I also put medical providers on here in a bullet because what we know from our research is that about 45% of the time that an adult is criminalized for a self-managed abortion, it's because a medical provider reports them to the police or to Child Protective Services. I'll talk more about that in a minute, but I just wanted to note that as sort of a risk factor and potentially and a circumstantial reason why folks might be criminalized. I also have other participants up here on the circumstantial bullet list, which is supposed to sort of refer to friends, family, partners, etc. Next slide, please. So many of you are likely familiar with mandatory reporting and have been required to attend trainings, whether they're state or organizationally mandated, on who is a mandatory reporter and how mandatory reporting works. I was a mandatory reporter whenever I worked in domestic violence. I worked pretty exclusively with young people, and I remember how scary it felt to have to deal with that and know that that was something that the state was requiring me to do. But just in case folks are new or don't have a lot of experience with this, when I talk about mandatory reporting, I'm talking about a state law or a policy that requires certain professionals to report things like child abuse, injuries, etc. And I will be referring specifically to state-based requirements. It's possible that organizations or institutions where you work might have their own requirements that go above and beyond what a state requires around reporting. And notably, mandatory reporting is different from permissive reporting. So, for example, in some states, domestic violence advocates are not mandatory reporters, and instead they might be encouraged by the state or by their organization to report violence in certain circumstances, but not actually required to report. Next slide, please. This is like my number one takeaway that I want you to go home with. This is what I talk to healthcare providers about all the time. It's what I talk to social workers about. So generally, no one is required to report self-managed abortion to the police or to Child Protective Services, and doing so is actually likely a HIPAA violation. There's a recent update to HIPAA, which is the health privacy law at the federal level, that actually makes this much more clear that if there is not an explicit requirement to report self-managed abortion to the police, and we have not found any of those, then it is a HIPAA violation for someone to report, someone who is working at a HIPAA-covered entity, to report that to the police. And we'll talk about this more in depth as I go along, but it's really, this is my major takeaway that I want you to have. Next slide, please. So this slide again has the photo of folks who are at a protest or at an action with their fists in the air. And it says mandatory reporting, and then I have a couple of bullets here that I'm going to say out loud. So all states have some form of mandated reporting, even if that's just limited to child abuse. And data shows us that both class and race bias exist in mandatory reporting. And I'm going to use child abuse as an example here, not because it's related to self-managed abortion, but because we actually have the best data on bias in reporting around child abuse. In particular, we know that Black and Native American families are disproportionately reported for child abuse and neglect, even though the rates of child abuse are similar across racial lines. Black children are twice as likely to be reported as white children, and they're much more likely to be removed from their homes. Native American children are reported at 3 times the rate of white children. I've read a study recently that said in some states it's up to 4 times. And Native American children are also much more likely to be removed from their homes than white children are. Additionally, we know that quote-unquote suspected child abuse is ultimately subjective, meaning that it depends on the person. So I might see a child's bruise and suspect or assume that they got it playing, and another person might see the same bruise and suspect or assume abuse. And similar differences could exist when we observe a change in a child's behavior or their appearance. So our suspicions are based on biases that we already hold. So that makes child abuse statutes inherently very tricky to navigate, both for us and for the authorities in charge of enforcing them. And I know that child abuse is something that as advocates you might be more likely to deal with, but I want you to be thinking about how the bias in child abuse reporting can extend to other types of mandatory reports, including when someone reports a person for a pregnancy loss or other actions that that person takes during their pregnancy. Though there are exceptions to this rule, we really want to keep our eyes open about the fact that getting the police and child welfare involved in people's lives when they weren't there before can be both disruptive and harmful, particularly when survivors hold identities that are already at increased risk of harm from police and child welfare involvement, such as sex workers, LGBTQ folks, people with disabilities, and Black, Indigenous, and other people of color, particularly when folks hold more than one of these identities at once. We also know that, unfortunately, child welfare, even when they're not supposed to, sometimes uses the fact that someone is a victim of abuse against that person. I saw this happen when I worked in Oregon. And once child welfare is involved, it's possible that the child will exclusively see one or both of their parents in a foster or a supervised setting. So that can mean effectively eliminating one or both parents from a child's life in most meaningful ways. And I know that this group holds so much knowledge. So I'm hoping that as I keep talking, people can share in the chat what kinds of risks you've been aware of around bringing police or child welfare into a domestic violence situation, even when the workers and officers are well-meaning. So I'd love for folks to just put that in the chat, risks that you've been aware of around bringing police or child welfare into a situation where there's domestic violence. And while folks are putting that in, we can go to the next slide. So we know that studies have shown that in general, mandated reporting, though intended to prevent further harm, frequently actually worsens the situation that survivors find themselves in. And additionally, mandatory reporting laws have been data has shown that they deter survivors from sharing their full stories. So they deter help-seeking behaviors, meaning that survivors may be less likely to ask for help if they're aware that someone would be required to report their situation. And while we always recommend that you disclose upfront that you're a mandated reporter and what kinds of things you might have to report, we also know that conversely, mandatory reporting warnings can really make it more difficult for you to do your job, right? Because it means that people are not going to tell you as much as they might. So that's a really tricky situation and it's a really tricky balance. I would love for us to brainstorm together on the next slide some ways that we can make sure that people seeking help don't feel deterred by mandatory reporting laws. And I'm just going to read some of these things in the chat about how involving police and child welfare in a family that's experiencing domestic violence might bring some harm to that situation unintentionally. So it can break trust, right? It can break trust between you as an advocate and the person that you're serving. It can escalate emotions. It can be used against the non-offending parent in custody and divorce cases. In Oregon, we had a mandatory arrest law, right? So both parties had to be arrested if the police were called. Police or child protective services can escalate abuse. They can also increase the vulnerability of a survivor. They might be harmed once they leave. They're less likely potentially to reach out for help in the future. Predators can relocate their victims to a new jurisdiction, absolutely. Law enforcement sometimes aligns with the abuser. There are rural areas, right, where law enforcement may know the abuser personally, might be their friend or their associate or colleague. And then if there is legitimate risk of harm, investigators and police can criminalize the survivor for the abuse rather than the abuser, leading to their incarceration or removal of the children from the safe parent and placed with the abuser or with another abuser. Someone has worked with a protective parent who lost custody of their children. Reporting before an individual is ready to leave or move forward can greatly impact their lives financially, physically, emotionally. Their lives might be uprooted. And quote unquote failure to protect as a reason to take children from the home sometimes further victimizes mothers and children living in abusive homes. I've never met mothers more dedicated to protecting their kids than mothers who have stayed in abusive homes, because at least there they can intervene versus co-parenting and sharing custody with an abuser. So those are great shares. Thank you all so much. Oh, Kellen says it might lead to murder. Yes, that is unfortunately a reality. So now I want us to do another group brainstorm. I'm curious as to how you all might balance reporting obligations if you have them, and also try and ensure that the survivors that you're working with remain in control of their own situation. So one of the ways that I've already named is to ensure that survivors fully know and understand your reporting obligations before you speak with them, right? That can help them feel like they're retaining at least some control in the situation. But I'm curious about other ways we can balance reporting obligations with ensuring that survivors stay in control of their own situation as much as we can help them to be. Include them in making the report 100%. This is something that I talk to medical providers about a lot. It's so important to include that person so that they can, really know what's going on, and also potentially you can help reduce the risk of harm in the report. Having internal policies to staff cases with supervisors to eliminate bias in reporting, yes. Communicate the limits to confidentiality at the top. When something is brought up that is reportable, let them know, include them, help them safety plan around what has to be reported and next steps. When entering into conversations that might lead to discussions of child abuse, remind them again of my mandated reporting requirements so that they can choose how and what to share with me. Yes, I did this a lot with young people, would just remind them again and again, right, what I might have to do. If a report is mandated, speaking with protective parent first, connect them with resources prior to the call to ensure they're safe. Safety planning, providing examples. I let them know they don't have to answer a question if they don't feel comfortable and what we would be speaking about. I make sure not to ask questions that aren't necessary. Having a strong connection to folks who can advocate, implement interagency agreements, and care coordination teams. And there's a question in here about, isn't every adult in Indiana a mandatory reporter, regardless of occupation? So that really varies state by state. I don't know the law in Indiana off the top of my head, but there are several states that say that everyone is a mandatory reporter for child abuse specifically, that everyone is a mandatory reporter. That's not true in all states. So good to know what your state's law is. But yes, absolutely, that can be true. Okay, let's see. Okay. Some other things that we might do, right? Offer the fact that you can't report what you don't know. You could potentially, at your agency, if it's possible, employ someone who is not a mandatory reporter, right? That might not be possible in states where everyone is a mandatory reporter for child abuse. Survivors can speak in hypotheticals. The advocate could speak in hypotheticals. There could be a route for people to talk to you or your agency anonymously via phone or email. You can interrogate whether or not this is a situation that really truly requires reporting from you, or if there's wiggle room. So those are just some other ideas about what folks can do. Next slide, please. So I don't want to make assumptions that none of you are doctors or attorneys in addition to being advocates, but I do want to make sure and communicate where we think the lines are between giving legal and medical advice and simply sharing information or helping someone work through a decision. So medical advice looks like telling someone what they should do in order to address a medical issue. It does not look like describing what happens during an abortion, whether clinical or self-managed. It does not look like helping a survivor weigh how they're feeling about their pregnancy. Similarly, for legal advice, that looks like telling someone what they should do in a legal situation. It does not look like helping someone go through generalized questions or sharing knowledge about the law itself. For example, telling someone that self-managed abortion is not a crime in your state is not legal advice. And because self-managed abortion is not a crime in your state, the law does not prohibit us from sharing general information about self-managed abortion. You can look at IfWhenHow's website in order to get examples of what type of information we can freely share. As another example, it would be legal advice for me to tell a community-based abortion provider exactly what that person should do in order to avoid running afoul of the law. It would not be legal advice for me to share with that person what I know about the law in general, or to answer any general questions about the law. Applying the law to a set of facts is when you start practicing. Next slide, please. So letting a survivor know what a healthcare provider might be required to report is not legal or medical advice. And it might be one of the questions that a survivor has for you. Since all states are different, our team is in the process of making fact sheets for all 50 states that cover mandatory reporting obligations for healthcare providers. We'll make sure to send over a link to the fact sheets that are completed. And additionally, if you have questions that are specific to your state, we have a technical assistance form. So we'll make sure to pop that link into the chat as well. And just a reminder, we can't always give legal advice that's specific to your situation and technical assistance, but we can answer general questions about what the law in your state is. And we may be able to give legal advice to your clients or your program participants if they're seeking legal advice related to self-managed abortion or pregnancy loss. And now I am going to pass it back to Rebecca for tips regarding direct support.
Hi, thanks, Lauren. Yeah, I'm just going to run through, and we can also go to the next slide. I'm going to run us through some commonly asked questions in terms of, is this legal or is this not legal? And this is the text that I'm just going to go ahead and read directly off of the slides. So let's say, you want to share abortion resources with a survivor. They are looking for abortion care, and your funding does not specifically restrict that. Can you do that? Absolutely, you can. The First Amendment pretty broadly protects our right to share information, including abortion information. Of course, as Lauren mentioned, the tricky thing is making sure you are just providing information and not inadvertently providing advice. Second, what if we want to help survivors who are looking for abortion care assess and plan for whatever the legal landscape is in their state and what risks may be coming from their abuser? Can you do that safety planning with them? Absolutely, yes, you can. Even in states that restrict abortion, it is completely legal to talk to a survivor about what their potential risk might be, what to think about when accessing abortion care. That is not a crime. Thirdly, what if we want to keep Plan B on hand as part of our programs and in our shelters and distribute that? You can do that. Plan B is an over-the-counter drug for people of all ages. It is not illegal in any state, and it is not an abortion pill, despite some legislators kind of conflating it with an abortion pill. It is not. We can go ahead and go to the next slide. So here's where it gets a little bit more complicated. So questions about legal risks for supporting survivors. Number one, do mandatory reporting laws require advocates to report survivors who want to seek abortions or self-manage abortion? No, we've done a lot of extensive research on this. We've found no law in any state that requires a mandatory reporter to report a self-managed abortion or a clinic-based abortion to either law enforcement or child protective services, child welfare. And in fact, doing so may potentially violate protections that exist for survivors as well. Next, would it be legal for our programs to give a survivor money to buy abortion pills? It's going to depend, which is, I know, an answer that nobody wants to get from lawyers. It's a big maybe. The answer really depends on what the laws are in your particular state, whether the pills are going to be used to self-manage, whether they're being sourced from a clinic, and a lot of other factors around potential legal risk as well. You can go to the next slide. So I know we mentioned a lot of these aiding and abetting bounty hunter laws like SB 8 in Texas. Could we be sued under these laws if we help survivors seeking abortion care? That's pretty unlikely. Only a few states have these laws on the books. Again, as I pointed out earlier, none of them. There's been no successful case arising out of them. The circumstances they require for raising a lawsuit are actually, again, pretty specific. Of course, anybody who wants to could absolutely attempt to start a lawsuit. And it is kind of up in the air of what a judge will allow to proceed. And so if you're concerned about that or somebody has raised a lawsuit, absolutely recommend folks in states with aiding and abetting laws consult an attorney in their state for legal advice. Next up, we've heard that some prosecutors in states that ban abortion want to file charges against anyone who helps somebody leave a state to get an abortion. Could we be prosecuted if we help a survivor leave their state? Also, this is pretty unlikely. We've certainly heard prosecutors and legislators say that they want to do that, but people still have the constitutional right to travel in the United States, and the law would simply not support prosecuting somebody for traveling through the abortion.
Rebecca, you've frozen for me.
Restriction for adults helping young people leave the state. That's Idaho.
I think Rebecca's going to try turning off her video to see if that helps. Okay. While we're waiting for Rebecca to come back, we can go to the next slide and then we'll come back to this one. Oh, I'm getting messages. Hold on. Oh, yeah, Becca got booted, so I'm going to keep going. So some additional considerations that we want you all to be thinking about are there is a person in Texas named Jonathan Mitchell who really is trying to target abusive partners to get them to bring lawsuits against either their actual partners or the folks who helped them, right? So we have some examples where we know of where he has helped a abusive partner sue the people who helped his partner to his ex-partner to get an abortion. So that is also something to sort of be on the lookout for, that this is potential. There's potential for this. We also are still doing analysis of, there is a new law in Louisiana that has classified abortion pills as controlled substances. Classifying abortion pills as controlled substances has some implications for the way in which both they are distributed and the way in which they can be used, right? So there are laws in some cases that criminalize the possession of controlled substances without a prescription. There might be laws that restrict folks' ability in Louisiana to have access to other types of abortion, right? So that's something to sort of be thinking about, be watching for more information about, because we're still analyzing how that might happen. I am going to go ahead and go over our resources slide, which is next. So we talked about this a little in the beginning, but we want to make sure that folks know about Repro Legal Helpline. It's a helpline that you or your clients can call, and we provide legal services around abortion, pregnancy loss, and birth. The vast majority of the time, folks are calling because they have questions about self-managed abortion, and they want to know about their personal legal risk. And then we also have a Repro Legal Defense Fund. So this fund works to support things like bail and strong defenses for folks who are arrested or otherwise criminalized for pregnancy loss. And then we also have a network. We are expanding our network. We used to just have attorneys in our network, but we actually just sent out an email, I think today, talking about how we're really looking for all types of advocates to be a part of our network, because people who are in crisis around the country that call us need a community of support around them. So we need attorneys, we need doulas, we need folks who, drive people to appointments, right? Practical support volunteers. We need all kinds of folks to be part of our network, because that means that when we experience an issue of someone being criminalized or being at severe risk of criminalization in a state, we can really mobilize around that person from afar by helping to activate our network that's close to them. And then I know that we had some questions pop up in the Q&A, so I'm going to go to those until I know that Rebecca is back. So we have, what type of legal processes are abusers using to substantiate they have a potential parental interest in a pregnancy? So I think that we have seen abusers use the law in all kinds of different ways. I think that the one that I mentioned in Texas is really the one that stands out the most to me, where they're trying to use these bounty hunter laws to try and come after the people who supported their partner to have an abortion. I do know that we have also seen abusers really use the law when we're talking about things like IVF, right? So if for example a couple has embryos frozen, right? There's been some high profile legal battles between couples about custody of those embryos. So that's another way that abusers have used the law around reproduction. I know that there are other things that I'm not thinking of in the moment, but certainly there are a variety of ways that this might happen. And then we also had a question about, is Plan B or the morning after pill classified legally as self-managed abortion? And that's a great question. The answer is no. Plan B or the morning after pill is contraception, so it's not legally classified as self-managed abortion. And if folks have other questions, please feel free to pop those in the chat. I see that someone asked if it would be useful to share SAS training opportunities with this group. I think it's useful to share SAS training opportunities with everyone. So SAS stands for Self-Managed Abortion, Safe and Supported. And they do trainings for folks about how to support the people in their lives who are experiencing a self-managed abortion. So yeah, please feel free to pop that information into the chat. Yeah, Rebecca, are you back yet?
I am sorry, my Wi-Fi, of course, chose to die at that exact moment.
No worries. Can we go back to this? I think it's slide 48 with questions about legal risks for supporting survivors, because I would love, Rebecca, if you could sort of start over on that slide, because you froze a couple of times, and then maybe we can come back to questions.
Absolutely. So questions about legal risks for supporting survivors. Yeah, a lot of questions around civil aiding and abetting and bounty hunter laws like the ones in Texas. The concern is, could we be sued under those laws if we help a survivor who is looking for abortion care? This is pretty unlikely. Again, only a few states have these laws, and again, no lawsuits have been successful from under these laws because it is so hard to prove the facts. because most people who wanted to get an abortion, they just left the state. So there was no way to prove that they got an illegal abortion in the state. Could somebody who wanted to file a lawsuit for no reason just to harass advocates? Absolutely. But there really would be no legal grounds for doing so. But if that happens, or you're concerned that it might happen, absolutely. If you're living in a state with an aiding and abetting law, highly encourage you to reach out to an attorney in your state. And then the other thing was like about prosecutors looking like they might want to go after people who help with travel out of state for people seeking abortions. Could you get in trouble for helping somebody leave the state to get a clinical abortion? Also pretty unlikely. Prosecutors and legislators are definitely saying that. I think the intention there is to scare people, as we've said before, is the major strategy in these cases. But people do still have the constitutional right to travel. It would be really unlikely for them to raise any kind of legal basis for preventing somebody from traveling for clinical abortion care. But we do have a network of attorneys that would assist and step in and provide legal representation and legal funds if that did happen to you. And that's the Abortion Defense Network, which we can share as part of our resources as well. And then my last note about this is Idaho and other states are looking to pass similar laws, does restrict non-parent adults from helping a minor leave the state to get an abortion. And the really tricky thing about Idaho is even if the adult had parent permission to help the young person leave the state, it doesn't prevent them from initially being investigated. It's just a defense that they can raise later on. Again, the strategy here is to go after young people because they're vulnerable, and legislators can say this is out of concern for parental rights. But really, it all comes back to trying to scare and isolate young people and cut them off from adults that they trust and that want to help. And we can go to the next slide. Did we cover the next slide?
Yes, I think we can skip
Great.
down to questions. And if anyone has any more questions, please feel free to pop them into the chat and we'll try and come back to them. But I want to turn it back over to Lo to talk a little bit about Provide before we finish.
Thank you so much, Lauren. And Kara, if you don't mind advancing the slide. Wonderful. So continuing this work, one thing I want you all to leave with is to know that you aren't alone. Between Provide and If, When, How, we're here to support you. So if this is the first time you're learning about this information, don't worry because we're here to support you along your journey. We have a wonderful resource library where you can access our tools, and we firmly believe that it's not a one-size-fits-all situation. So we love to create tailored support for organizations based on your needs and your concerns. We also offer training for addressing stigma and making abortion referrals in multiple different platforms, including webinars, in-person trainings at your organization, and we are currently working on asynchronous content that is self-paced. And you can advance the slide. I'm putting a link to our resource library in the chat. These on the slide are screenshots of two of our tools that you can use when working specifically with survivors. We know that you might not be talking about pregnancy every single day. So we want you to have tools that you can rely on to have those conversations that can guide you through what to cover with a survivor. These are things that we can provide to you free of charge. Once again, all of our services are free. And if you can advance the slide again. Another thing I want to mention is that right now we're working on a tool to support organizations having internal conversations about abortion referrals and self-managed abortion. So stay tuned for that and reach out to us if you're interested in learning more. I put our email in the chat, info@providecare.org. So next steps after today, please, please, please complete the post survey. You have a very high chance of winning one of 3 $200 gift certificates. Join us for our next training or webinar, which you can find on our website. Reach out to us for organizational support at that email I posted. And please stay involved. It's so important that we continue to have these conversations. And I'm just checking the questions. There's one more question that I want to throw back to Lauren or Rebecca, unless they are answering it. Okay, it looks like they answered it directly. So I'll pass it back to whoever's next, and we can advance the slide.
Okay, this would be me, Patty. Thank you so much, Lo, Lauren, and Rebecca. Wow, this has been an incredible training. So much gratitude for you and the work that you do. So huge thank you to you and to our wonderful interpretation team. Also, many thanks to everyone who joined us today. Please be sure to complete the follow-up survey, and the link has been shared in the chat. If you have additional questions for Provide and if, when, how, please reach out to them directly. I know the contact information has been shared in the chat as well. And if you are interested in learning more about NRCDV resources and upcoming events, please follow us at NRCDV on Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. Thank you all so much and have a rest of your day.